Amen. So, for those who have been around for the last few weeks, because I know it's been a bit choppy and so on, we kind of ran through the process of kind of looking at the sort of unfolding, developing revelation through the Old Testament. We came to the end of the Old Testament last week, and we saw that kind of prophesied in Daniel's 70 weeks with the initial 49 years. And 49 years after Ezra's edict, the Old Testament is complete. It's sealed up and it's done. So what we're looking at now is we're going to kind of, if you like, pick up some of the prophetic context that has been left at the end of the Old Testament.
So just check you are recording.
I am recording, yes.
Right.
Yep, I am. Yep. So we're going to pick up the kind of prophetic context from the end of the Old Testament. We're going to start winding our way through the Inter-Testamental period. In terms of how much detail, you'll notice it's a bit patchy in the sense of I did this some years back and for the first time and kind of told the story of the intertestamental period, and people found it really useful, but I'd done it at a very high level kind of way. What's happened is each time I get a chance to do something again, I was just saying this to Howard, you get to slot a little bit more in. So every now and again we've got a moment which I've got a fair bit of biblical kind of background to, and then we have a number of points that cover a few hundred years and we just ignore those. But eventually maybe we'll have it'll all be nicely put together. But hopefully you'll enjoy seeing some things this evening as we work through. The graphic isn't really to tell us very much. It's just I was sitting here just before we started and thought we ought to have a nice opening graphic, and went and found this little timeline on Google and just slapped it into the presentation there. But it's not bad actually, because it actually kind of covers very much the period we're looking at. We're going to think of some of the prophetic context from just before Daniel. I think we've certainly got some Ezekiel and a little bit from Jeremiah and Isaiah as well, which has kind of been left hanging at the end of the Old Testament. So, oops, nope, there we go. Obviously, yes. So if we kind of look at Daniel, of course, sets the framework for us, and so when we spent a bit of time last week looking at his prophecies. So of course he has. Is it Daniel 2 or 3? Andrew, you can help me. 2, isn't it? Yeah, 2. Daniel 2, where he has he responds to Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the image, the statue, and with a head of gold, with a kind of torso and arms of silver, with the kind of waist and thighs of brass, and then iron and clay kind of feet or legs coming down. And I found that nice little graphic that kind of illustrated those empires with the faces on the other side. The understanding of Daniel's kind of empires, and which then gets picked up in the four beasts as well, I take the long term traditional view. Having said that, there is a slight minority view that is just as long term. It's just always been the minority, if I can put it that way, which sees everything finishing actually with the Greek Empire. So it kind of splits the Medo and Persian Empire into two, and so on. But traditionally, and we'll think about some of the fulfillments as we kind of roll them forward. What we see Daniel seeing is he actually does it in 3 different prophetic visions. He has there's the vision of the man which he interprets, or the statue. There's the vision of the 4 beasts coming up out of the sea, which of course gives us if you like, the symbolic or the prophetic imagery that then gets picked up in the book of Revelation. So it's very kind of current. And actually what's quite tricky, and what I don't want to do tonight, is to kind of get, if you like, a vanilla version of understanding what it is that Daniel is prophesying. By which I mean is when you get to things that are as colourful as we're going to see Daniel's prophecies are, it's almost impossible for people not to pile in with lots of multiple sub-variants and opinions and so on. And we see the same thing happens with Revelation as happens with Daniel. And it's not that I never want to be dismissive of those views. It's just I think that wisdom says we have to hold it quite lightly. I say this quite regularly, just because I think it's a good approach to the prophetic, which is that when we get to the more convinced we become of our interpretation, the more likely we are to be wrong. Is my kind of is my simple kind of way of looking at it. Which is why I think that in Jesus' day, everybody kind of missed him, if I can put it. All the experts who had been studying who the Messiah should be for years, and who had their timelines and had their absolutely knew to a T that it had to be this way, didn't see what was happening. They missed the visitation. And I tend to think that actually it's the kind of thing that as you live within the context, you see reflections of these things and you understand it as you go through. But when you are kind of sitting in the abstract, trying to say, well, this means it's going to be exactly like this and this bit literal, but this is just figurative, because all analysis makes those choices. This bit's literal, this bit's figurative. We're almost certainly, while we might land on it by accident, it's kind of a bit complicated. So I'm going to, everything we're looking at tonight, I think, is kind of what you might call the vanilla version, which is what most of us kind of agree is the kind of core level. You'll find there are plenty of versions of these things that tell you have to see this and it has to be that way. It becomes a bit more narrow and a little bit more certain. But so yeah, I've got yes, it was Daniel 2. It's obvious because it says there on the bottom, doesn't it? And as for this statue, its head was of fine gold, its breast of arms and silver, its belly and thighs of brass, its legs of iron, its feet part iron and part clay. You saw until the stone was cut out without hands, which struck the image on the feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. And then the iron and clay, the brass, the silver and the gold was broken in pieces. And the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. And so we kind of, yeah. And then, of course, as it goes on in Daniel, we get to Daniel 7, he has his vision of the 4 creatures, 4 great animals that come out of the sea. Each was different from the other. The first was like a lion, but with eagle's wings, and a man's heart was given to it. The second was like a bear. It was raised up on one side with 3 ribs were in its mouth. And they said, arise, devour much flesh. Another like a leopard had on its back 4 bird wings. And the animal also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. And the 4th animal was awesome and powerful. And this is always a fun one. If you go and look for visual images of the 4th beast, I chose what I thought were generally quite kind of generically soft sort of images. For some reason, there's a lot of people who've done airbrush paintings of the 4th images and made him like a T-Rex, but with 10 horns. I don't know if anyone's gone to look at that. I could find an awful lot. And I thought, I just don't want to have a Tyrannosaurus Rex on my... a 10-horned Tyrannosaurus Rex is the way they've described it, because I suppose they think that's the most terrifying. But I actually think that one at the end, although it doesn't quite look like it, I think the idea of the bull is most likely... is probably it's just referred to as a kind of a great beast, because you do find then a resonance with that, with the images that in Revelation where we see the beasts that come out of the sea. And actually there is a kind of a very deliberate reference in the book of Revelation to John, who is writing on Patmos, which is right in the middle of the Aegean Sea, is completely surrounded by the cult of Europa. And Europa's story is she is carried off by Jupiter, who's the king of the gods, and ravaged, and he is in the form of a great wild bull, you see. And in John in his revelation, as God is speaking to him, using the imagery that's around him, he sees it's not this great bull is a great beast, if you like, with a woman riding on it. So he's seeing the cult that surrounds him at the moment, which of course gives Europe its name. But I'm not going to get too much into the kind of, if you like, out there prophecy. I want us to actually track through the history as we see kind of what's happening. Because, as I say, the long term view of the church would be to start by saying that the first kingdom is Babylon. The second one is the Medo-Persian Empire. Third one is Greece, and the 4th one is Rome. And within that context, that gives us a nice framework as we kind of roll through it of understanding the Inter-Testamental period. And we see kind of hints and nuances of the things that are going to happen in terms of world powers as we kind of go through. So, okay, now watch this. You'll be impressed by this. Hang on. How do I do it? Here we go. Look at this. So this is actually drone footage of ancient Babylon.
Wow.
Have you seen that? Yeah, this was actually done for
one winged creature, was it?
It's on one of the, we're actually riding a winged creature right now. It was actually done. I found this online when I was looking for an image.
That is at the Pergamon Museum.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It was done as a museum thing for a walkthrough for people, and you can
but
get.
The actual gate is in the.
Oh, I see.
Museum,
Okay.
Along with the altar of Zeus from Pergamum.
Yeah. Well, so this kind of fly through as we're looking at it was actually done for I think it was a museum in Canada, and they put it online so you can sort of download it and have a look at it. So it really doesn't add anything to what we're saying, but I just thought, that's nice. It looks impressive, doesn't it? But what I do want to kind of get is in terms of this kind of prophetic context is and actually how kind of sophisticated the ancient world was. Now we have to remember, of course, this is built in blood, really, these things. But they were the empires really were quite impressive. They're much more so than probably Hollywood has ever done them justice for with any of their old biblical epics. So this keeps going for a few minutes. We'll move on. So I'm kind of picking out Isaiah's prophecy. He talks about Babylon, the jewel of kingdoms, the glory of the Babylonians' pride. And you're kind of seeing from there, and that actually is absolutely right, that as a city, Babylon just hits a brand new scale compared with anything that's kind of gone before it. But Isaiah has prophesied already, you'll be overthrown by God like Sodom and Gomorrah, which we have difficulty even finding and locating them now, although I think they think they know roughly where they were, but it's hard. So when Cyrus conquered Babylon, though, just to kind of give it its context, which we covered last week, 539 BC, not last week, but last time we met, it was actually the world's biggest city. It's perhaps the first city in history to have broken 200,000 inhabitants living in it. Its walls were 20 meters thick. So, yeah. It supported 250 watchtowers. They were surrounded by water, which was kind of channeled from the Euphrates. The Euphrates ran both through the city and round one side, and then I think they put a moat round it. Yeah. And so yes, but actually Cyrus actually conquered the city by diverting the Euphrates into a kind of a depression downhill, so that the water ran away, drained the moats and drained the river, and they just walked in through the there is actually, I think, one of the prophecies in Isaiah talks about him being an open door or something, and effectively that's how he didn't break the siege because they ran out of food. While they were sieging it, they diverted the river and then just were able to kind of walk in through the empty channels. But after he conquered it, just to kind of give you the context, it's as I say, yeah, in the centuries that followed, various smaller towns sprung up on the site. Actually, under Islamic rule, so now into the AD, it actually became a village that sourced bricks, and then eventually it just disappeared. So it was just by Islamic rule, by 700, it was just a village now. So this great, incredible city that in Isaiah's day was so impressive, which he's prophesied are going to come, and eventually they haven't yet conquered Jerusalem, but he sees the whole thing coming and prophesies that one day it won't even exist. It'll be overthrown like Sodom and Gomorrah, and he goes on to say, I'll turn her into a place for owls and into a swampland. I'll sweep her with the broom of destruction, declares the Lord Almighty. And actually, for a long time, we didn't know where Babylon was. It was actually only refound during the 19th century. But most of the city, even today, we haven't excavated because it's still swamped by the Euphrates. And even more of the ancient city is actually below the water table, so it is just slobby swampland.
Is that in the Kurdish swamps?
I don't know, actually. It's a good question. I'm putting in the bits that I knew, but there's bits I don't know as well, so I don't want to. But that apparently is. That 3% I actually looked up this afternoon. It's on Wikipedia. It's how much has been excavated because of the problem of the water levels. So here's Isaiah writing well before even the heyday of kind of Babylon's kind of power. Is that she'll be swept with a broom of destruction. Well, she became a little village, exporting bricks before disappearing totally for millennia. And even what has now been uncovered, and there's famously Saddam Hussein used to kind of be able to look out and be able to see the bits that have been done, but that actually only represents 3% of the city.
You have bricks embossed.
Oh, is that right?
With as a sort of I'm rebuilding Babylon.
He used to talk about it, didn't he? Because
Yeah.
that was always one of those things that people got very excited about in a prophetic way. But really, in one sense, just getting actually. This is part of the reason, because it's interesting how often we forget why the prophets were important. And Isaiah is important because actually people can't argue with his dating. They will argue sometimes that he's a bit later, but they can't kind of have gone all the way through the millennium. We see that quite regularly with some of these slightly longer term. They're sometimes less instantly impressive, but when you look at the longer term, they've got it just spot on, correct as to what's going to happen to these places. And after the Babylonians, of course, came the Medo-Persian, which is the torso and the arms of silver. And actually, in Daniel we get an extra prophecy as well, which relates to the Medo-Persians. He said, "I lifted up my eyes." So, actually, did I skip over it? Not read the four beasts. Yeah, so I didn't actually read through. Yes, obviously there's the lion with eagle's wings, the bear with ribs in its mouth, and there's a leopard with 4 heads and 4 sets of wings, or 4 wings, and then there's the awesome, powerful beast with 10 horns. But as we get into Daniel 8, he gives us a second. Where are we? Yeah, he gives us another view of the Medo-Persian. "I lifted my eyes and I saw a ram with 2 horns, and the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. And I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, and southward. And the ram which you saw, the 2 horns, they're the kings of Media and Persia." And so in the book of Daniel, of course, Daniel lives through into the beginnings of the Medo-Persian Empire. He gives us this image with 2 horns, and that is, of course, the fact that we refer to this empire as really as 2 big nations that are working together cooperatively to form an empire. And to kind of give a little bit of context to it, it says, this is Daniel, so I lift my, here's the verse we just read them, 2 horns were high, one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. And I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, and southward. So Cyrus the Great becomes king of Persia in 559, but he becomes king of Persia. At the moment, Persia is just a kind of it's owned by Media, so it's a kind of a largish nation, and the Medes are more powerful than the Persians at the moment. But it seems to be part of the royal family, like his predecessors, though. So while he's king of Persia, he's not independent. He has to recognize Median dominance. But in 549, so Cyrus overthrows the Medes, King Astyages, who is a relative possibly of Cyrus, and he's possibly Cyrus's grandfather. He's either basically an uncle or grandfather. Can't quite tell from the historic records. And he's also probably this king here, Astyages. I think he actually appears probably in scripture. He probably appears, but as Ahasuerus, but not the one that Esther was married to. I think there's another minor reference at one point. It may even be in Daniel to an Ahasuerus, and he seems to be part of the same family line.
But
Darius is the Mede, yes, and he as we'll see, actually, I'm not sure if he comes into this story. He definitely pops into the bits of the prophecy. Darius the Great is proper Persian. Darius the Mede is he's kind of co-regent with Cyrus. Well, he's not a regent, but he seems to be the general who leads the campaign on behalf of Cyrus. So the Bible gives us 2 versions, one where it's Cyrus who takes Babylon and the other where it's Darius. But that's not complicated to understand. It's just the ancient world's way of recognizing. It's like in Alexander's campaigns, we'll think later tonight. He has a guy that's with him, Ptolemy, who then takes over a quarter of the empire and becomes the Ptolemaic kind of empire. But really, who is it who wins Egypt? Was it Ptolemy or was it Alexander? Because they're part of the same. One is the senior over the other. So the Medo-Persians. So really, we're just kind of laying this kind of context to kind of see the story unfold as we go through. So the Persians were the largest empire in ancient history. So Babylon was that most impressive of cities, but Persia actually extends its space. So it rules more than 2.9 million square miles. It spans 3 continents, and it's estimated in 480 BC, so just before the end of the Old Testament. Persia actually included 50 million people under its authority, which is 44% of the world's population at the time. So this is the context that, as I say, that Daniel's laying out the prophetic flow. You can see Judea there, right smack bang in the middle of it, as it always has been, in the middle of all the action. Of course, it's during the reign of Cyrus the Great that Jews are allowed to return home to Jerusalem, as we were looking at a couple of weeks ago. We were looking at the end of the Old Testament story. So we now actually, before we hit the Greeks, we kind of hit the Inter-Testamental period. So 4th century BC. So it's around 400. The Old Testament has now been sealed up. We have this kind of prophetic context from Daniel, some that goes back to, as we're going to see as it unfolds, there's some things hanging from Ezekiel, things from Isaiah, but very much so from Daniel, because he's really spelt out this kind of time frame. In 400 BC, Greece, who's the third of Daniel's 4 empires, it's kind of beginning to grow in prominence. It's not really an empire at this stage, but it is kind of growing. There are 10,000 Greek mercenaries who joined Cyrus the Younger, I should say. Cyrus the Younger comes a few generations after Cyrus the Great. He's unsuccessful in his attempt to defeat Artaxerxes. There is a possibility, some ancient historians see Artaxerxes as Ahasuerus in Esther, but I go with the early church fathers who see Xerxes before him. They are both, strangely, although they don't sound at all to us, they are ways of they become the name that becomes Xerxes or Artaxerxes can become much more sounding like Ahasuerus. But the key point here really is the Greeks beginning to learn and understand their kind of military might that goes with their intelligence and so on, as they become quite a sophisticated culture. And so there's 10,000 Greek mercenaries who join with this unsuccessful attempt to defeat Artaxerxes. And one of them is the historian, philosopher and student of Socrates, Xenophon, who gives us a lot of the history, therefore, of Socrates. Now, this little map on the side, you can see that dotted line. So this is where the 10,000 of them get picked up. So they're right on the edge of the Persian Empire, right in the kind of corner edge. They head all the way down. And when it all goes wrong, then, of course, Artaxerxes, because they've been in the coup against them, is going to kill them. So basically, they fight their way all the way back home. But part of the whole process starts to bring into their thinking their kind of, if you like, their cleverness and their military cunning and so on. And so it kind of represents a sort of a little kind of turning point, as we've already had kind of predicted by Daniel as we kind of come of what's going to come with the growth of the Greeks. So in 399, Socrates is condemned to death. It's about a year after Xenophon gets back. Because he gets back at the end of 400, I think, roughly around that kind of period. He gets back just in time for Socrates' death. Socrates was his kind of tutor before he left. Interestingly, he went and consulted an oracle and told Socrates, and Socrates told him off, you see. Not because he went on a military expedition, because he was only interested in how much money he would make if he went on the military expedition. So Socrates wasn't so impressed by that, apparently. But anyway, Socrates is condemned to death. It's one of those kind of interesting little moments in history, because he comments that the world would probably kill a perfect man if ever there was one. He was slightly biased in that, because of course he makes the point just because he's just been sentenced to death. So he probably, it's in that kind of you have to give it in that kind of context. Over in Persia, which is still dominant force, Artaxerxes now the third becomes ruler of Persia, and Philip the second becomes king of Macedonia. Philip, of course, who is Alexander's father. So in 338 BC, Philip actually conquers and unites Greece. And while Greece is now beginning to kind of really come together, so Persia is still dominant, Greece is beginning to come together, we see the kind of first signs of Rome growing, but now in a different area, which is in Europe. So if you kind of looked at if we go back to that map, which I should have had it on the slides, Persia stretches right the way towards the east. Greece is right on the western edge of that Persian Empire, and will kind of spread up around the Aegean, around the Mediterranean. Rome is kind of pushing in on the northern edge of that, and is going to obviously kind of grow and build its power up into Europe. So in Persia, Artaxerxes at this point is assassinated. 336, Philip dies, so Alexander becomes the king of Greece. And then Alexander starts a campaign in 334 BC, which eventually is going to conquer Persia, Phoenicia, and Egypt. And so his campaign actually fulfills prophecies that have been given by Ezekiel and Zechariah. So here's Ezekiel. So this is what the Lord says: I'm against you, O Tyre, and I will bring many nations against you, like the sea casting up its waves. That's Ezekiel 26. He goes on as you go through Ezekiel 26, saying that Tyre's walls and towers will be destroyed, and the debris will be scraped off the rock. Tyre will become a place where nets are spread. Those on the mainland are going to be killed before or after a siege. It's kind of a bit ambiguous. There's a whole siege thing going on. And Tyre's stones and timbers are going to get thrown into the sea. I could have done a lot more slides on Ezekiel's prophecy line by line, but I wanted to also blend in Zechariah with it, because we can see there's two kind of contexts here. So over the centuries, Tyre was attacked by multiple armies. I haven't got maybe I should look it up in my Bible so we can actually read the text. So Ezekiel 26, so that says, Lord, behold, I'm against you, Tyre. I'll bring up many nations against you. So it's going to bring up many waves, just as the sea brings up its waves. They'll destroy the walls of Tyre and break down her towers, and will scrape the debris from her and make her a bare rock. In 573, Nebuchadnezzar is actually the first person to conquer Tyre's mainland. He kills its occupants after a 13-year siege, which we get hints of, where it tells us, where are we? It talks about they'll slay your daughters on the mainland with the sword, and they'll make siege walls against you, and cast up mounds against you, and raise up large shield against you. So actually, Tyre was besieged for 13 years by Nebuchadnezzar, and he then did kill the people on the mainland. The next kind of wave comes in 333 BC, 333 to 332. Which is now Alexander, so that's why I put it in this context. So that of course 573 is the end of the Old Testament period, but Ezekiel's prophecy hasn't finished because he's talked about nations, plural, and there are some things in this context that haven't happened yet. But Alexander then comes up, and he conquers the island citadel by building a causeway using stones from the destroyed mainland. We'll have a look a bit more detail when we look at the Zechariah prophecy. And then a kind of a few years later, another Greek general, Antigonus, comes back in 314 as they start to rebuild, and besieges it again and destroys it. And eventually, the whole area that was Tyre, which was a great trading city, just becomes a fishing town. It was attacked in multiple. What have I put was traded? Oh, traded as in terms of it was swapped between empires and given away and so on. In multiple conflicts right the way up into the modern era, and it's just kind of one of those interesting things. It started in the 21st century. It is actually kind of as a town beginning to grow again. It's still only growing as a town, but that is, if you think in the ancient world, it has springs that produce 10 million gallons of fresh water a day. So the fact that it was just such a minor village for so much of a millennia really kind of fits in with Ezekiel's kind of prophecy, because he talks about it being kind of scraped down, having a spoil for their riches and so on. And then Zechariah had also, when they in the return, my apologies, it was the speed at which I was doing this. I put these into something I was doing online, and my scheme then was black against white. And when I kind of cut them in, of course, you couldn't see anything on the white background, so I've quickly made this grey. So that's why the colour has changed. No other reason than that. And I just didn't have time to go through and change them all. So Zechariah 9 also predicts Alexander the Great's conquest, and also not just of Tyre, but actually down the whole strip, down the side of the coast. and into Philistia, and actually talks about Jerusalem being divinely protected, which happens between 332 and 331 BC. And it's in that context where we have the famous oracle, oracle of the word of Yahweh is against the land of Hadrach. It will rest upon Damascus and Hamath. Also with its borders on it, Tyre and Sidon, because they were very wise. Tyre built herself strong and heaped up silver like the dust and fine gold like the mire of the streets. And the Lord will dispossess her and will cast her power into the sea, and she'll be devoured with fire. And Zechariah 9, 1-4, we have mentions Hamath, Tyre, and Sidon, which are all key cities up in Lebanon. So you've got them marked in those little pink. You can see the little pink Tyre, Sidon, and Hamath is on there somewhere. It didn't come across when I cut. It looks. Oh yes, it is. It's up the top. It's a bit further north. Can you see? So you see this Zechariah's context is the northern kind of strip of the kind of downward run of the Mediterranean. And Alexander kind of, as he comes down, he goes through Hamath and then Sidon. He comes to Tyre. Tyre, which is the mainland city, has been besieged by Nebuchadnezzar and beaten, but it's got a little island citadel that's never been taken. He gets there, and so he takes the ruined stones and the timbers, just as is prophesied, and he builds them out to build a causeway out to the citadel, and becomes the first man in history to actually take the citadel as well as the mainland part of the port. So Yahweh will dispossess her, that's Tyre, and cast her wealth into the sea. So Alexander actually kind of fulfills it. Zechariah 9, 5-8 then kind of lists three other places: Ashkelon, Gaza, Ekron, and Ashdod. And those are all key Philistine cities. And actually Alexander then continues going down south. He's actually on his way to Egypt. That's his. He's out to kind of go and beat up the Egyptians, which we're going to see. Because this period, I'm often interested that you often find that the key moments in history all come together. Because there's a few years here which really set things up for the story of the New Testament, and we're beginning to kind of run through them. And actually, the emergence of the Greeks as a military power, and the emergence of Alexander is a kind of a key kind of point. So actually, what actually happens in these places? So he defeats them quite straightforwardly. Ashdod and Ekron eventually get absorbed into Judah. And actually, as we see prophesied, you see in Zechariah 9, a mixed race will dwell in Ashdod. So they mix and commingle with Jews. There will be a remnant for our God, and Ekron will be like a Jebusite. So the Ekronites hold out, but like a Jebusite, if you remember, the Jebusites existed in the middle of the Promised Land as a kind of a separate little ethnic enclave. And actually, all of those things happen. So Zechariah's prophecy is right. Zechariah's prophecy predates actually predates Alexander by quite a few hundred years. Well, quite a few hundred years. We're talking 5th century, and this is now we're in the 6th century and now BC, and this is now 4th century BC. So a couple of hundred years ahead, but he's actually naming places which actually Alexander runs down in order: Hamath, Sidon, Tyre, now moving down Ashkelon, Gaza, Ekron. He's describing them in ways that actually happened to them. I know that's not really a big surprise to folks around here, but it's worth us just reminding ourselves of some of the details of these things. And I say it's worth us reminding because, I think it's part of critical thinking, if I put it this way. That there's a key in the word critical thinking, which is to think hard about stuff, requires you to stand outside yourself and argue against yourself. Have you noticed? So that's what critical thinking is. And so for part of my own, as I kind of critique my own faith, is to look at the things, and I look for the things I can't let go of. Does that make sense? And the things like this that I find really helpful in that environment. I wish more people, sorry, this is just a personal bugbear, I totally understand that very often we just like it all to be easy, if you see what I mean. And so I totally get and understand when people say, take the line of, well, Bible says it, I believe it, that settles it. But what it really means is I don't even want to think about it. I just want to kind of have it as whereas I like, personally, this is, I like to kind of argue with myself and know whether I really do. and sometimes that can be a bit unnerving, because sometimes I worry about myself and think, am I being too critical? But that's part of the process of how we get there. Am I losing my faith by asking questions? Yeah, no, I that's exactly the thing. But actually, I don't. You find that, but there are bits like this where which is why I kind of sometimes take time to spell it out. Nobody argues that Zechariah wasn't written when it claims it was. It's not really controversial, but he still gets these things darn accurate. And he was.
Criticism centers on Daniel, doesn't it?
Oh yeah, that's right.
He's so accurate.
He's so accurate. So they make him 200 years after it was written, but even then they can't explain the next 200 years. So it's kind of like have it one way or the other. So as Andrew was saying, that so it used to be kind of said, well, that it used to be claimed that Daniel, and there are still occasionally you'll still find some stubborn idiot who will still try and claim that Daniel wasn't really written until about 50 BC. And that was really common until the discovery of a copy of the book of Daniel in the Dead Sea Scrolls that went back to 200 AD. And of course it's been in the Septuagint in translation for 200 since 250. So it's it really doesn't make sense. But what actually happens at this point is as Alexander has kind of been going down, as he's been kind of running down, you'll notice, although it's not on there, if you see the top of the Dead Sea, so he's taken those southern cities. At this point, he kind of Alexander thinks, I'm going to go and get Jerusalem. So he's kind of come down the coast, decides to turn back, go for Jerusalem. And so Josephus gives us a detailed description of what happens. There's a lot more than this. I've just kind of given you the potted ... version with large chunks cut out. So Alexander, when he had taken Gaza, made haste to go up to Jerusalem, and Jadua, the high priest, was under terror as not knowing how he should meet the Macedonians. So you get the idea what's going on. So he's destroyed Tyre's sea citadel, which has never been taken before. He's done that successfully. He's come all the way down. So he ordained that the people should make supplications, in other words, big prayer meeting, and they should join with him in offering sacrifices, whom he besought to God, whom he sought to protect the nation and to deliver them from the perils that were coming upon them. Whereupon God warned him in a dream. ... So he gets some divine revelation. So cutting the story down, because it's quite a long description, Jadua leads out a festival procession out to meet Alexander. Alexander, it turns out, has had a dream too. So he is led to the temple by Jadua. So he rides into Jerusalem on a donkey. Well, actually, he doesn't. He rides in on a horse. But it becomes the context. You see, we see it fulfilled in Zechariah's prophecy, which is seen as, does this relate to Alexander, and then it becomes relating to Jesus. You see, and he is taken into the temple. He is actually shown scripture, which is probably therefore the Ezekiel passages, or maybe the Zechariah passages, just describing the places, which he is told, therefore that the temple has always prophesied him, and as a result he therefore offers sacrifices to Yahweh. Shown the book of Daniel, he sees himself in the prophecies there as well, and he eventually moves on and leaves Jerusalem intact. Because, of course, of the context of Zechariah, with the line he's taken down the coast and so on, the first, if you like, and we've touched on this before, that often prophecy is, because the word of God is living and active, is the way we understand it, or the Jewish understanding was it keeps on bearing fruit, kind of keeps circling and cycling. And so there is a sense in which Alexander becomes a type of Christ, even though he's not in the Bible, in that he becomes the obvious kind of clear fulfillment of the flow of the prophecies that Jesus is ultimately going to fulfill, but in a slightly different way, if we go put it those ways. But he becomes a very kind of natural, human level fulfillment of those things. Just keeping an eye on the time.
He dies at a similar age.
And he dies at the age of 33, of course, yeah. Which is actually why people are often convinced that Jesus is 33, is because of the ancient connection between Alexander and Jesus dying. So, if Jesus is born in 0 AD and dies in 33, you see, then he'd be 33. Except that actually he wasn't born in 0 AD, so he's not 33. But that's part of the kind of the reasoning. So Alexander stands as a contrast to Jerusalem's coming king of peace. So in Zechariah's prophecy, he prophesies, if you like, another king coming. So it is slightly different if you're reading it carefully. Rejoice greatly, daughter of Zion. Shout, daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king comes to you. See, so this is not their king. This is a conquering king. Your king, he is righteous, having salvation, lowly, riding on a donkey, even a colt, the foal of a donkey. And interesting is just to kind of draw it home. Verse 9 is 22 words long because there are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, and Jesus is actually hidden every 22nd letter. So here we go, nice colourful little kind of diagram showing it to you. Here's the kind of the Hebrew text. So the first Yod in exalt you exceedingly, daughter of Zion, as you're reading, right to left, isn't it? So you can see the Yod, and then the Shin from Jerusalem. Are being saved, so part of Isa, and then on the word colt is the ayin for Jesus' name. So there is that kind of sense of, you see kind of a type in history, but actually ultimately in the end this is really talking about Jesus. In 332 BC, Alexander has now moved on and he actually goes and conquers Egypt. And in conquering Egypt, he actually founds Alexandria, and he's actually at this stage, I haven't been able to find out whether he's collected them while he's been in Jerusalem or whether he's brought them with him, because remember, the Jews are already spread out across the world at this point. They're not all in, some have returned, but there are Jewish communities all over the old Persian Empire. But we do know that he has a very large contingent of Jewish soldiers with him when he conquers Egypt. And he founds Alexandria, and because the Jews were with him, a large Jewish community settled as part of the founding fathers of the city of Alexandria. He then leaves. He's done that campaign with his friend Ptolemy. He leaves with Ptolemy to India. They go off together at that point. A few years later, nearly 10 years later, Alexander declares himself as the son of Zeus. Wings. Oh yes, that's right. I was saying there were wings, if you like, on the leopard, which represents Greece, which probably are kind of hinting at his sense of divinity, or kind of taking on that kind of a divine aspect. He dies aged 33. At which point over the next year or so, really, his empire kind of is divided up between his generals. So by 300 BC, we've now got 4 kingdoms that have emerged, which is, of course, something, remember Daniel's prophecy, the leopard has 4 heads. So the 4 major generals that have worked with Alexander up to this point now, the empire sort of, it's there now more as a cultural empire with 4 regional kind of kingdoms to it. During this period, Jews from Assyria and Babylon are now being relocated right the way across the new empire. And actually, Jews have a fair amount of favour in the Greek Empire world. And we of course, eventually, the Hellenized or the Greekized, the Jews who got very into the kind of the Greek Empire and very influenced by it, become a major sect by the time of Jesus.
I can't get over how young Alexander was.
I know, it's amazing, isn't it? So here we go. Here's my not very good graphic, but at least.
As well.
So here you can see the 4 regions. So the Ptolemaic one, which is covering Egypt, and you'll notice, although it's not very clear, that kind of, that the borders kind of keep buzzing backwards and forwards during this period, and of course Jerusalem is right on the border. So it's kind of who's influencing it kind of changes as things go on. So they're all named after the various leaders. Ptolemy, Seleucia, I think, or something like Seleucus. Yeah, I can't remember. The kind of the 4 regions. So kind of now, as I say, we were kind of squeezing things up a little bit. So running now from 300 to 250 AD. What's happening at this period is Aramaic is now taking over from kind of classical Hebrew amongst the kind of the various Jewish communities. And during this period, therefore, so in the old Persian Empire, where we got largest communities of Jews, they're absorbing Assyrian, Babylonian, other words, and so Aramaic is developing as the kind of lingua franca, taking over from classical Hebrew. The good news is it actually means that they produce what originally done orally, the oral Talmuds, because we eventually get copies of them, which are kind of commentaries and ways of understanding the ancient Hebrew, and it's really, really helpful, because it actually the Talmuds actually give us, if you like, the mindset of the people who are reading the Old Testament. So if you like, the Jewish cultural community as they're reading the Old Testament, and that's where, as we've done in previous weeks when we looked at things like the development of the different messiahs, the different messianic figures, we're actually getting a lot of that information out of this kind of period as they start to lose their connection with their ancient language. They start to kind of retell the stories and explain them culturally for those that haven't grown up with them so instinctively, and that's really helpful for us to understand how they understood their own scriptures. I'll put it that way. Ptolemy the First, when he goes back, as I say, he's taken over Egypt. He actually forces 120,000 Jews to relocate with him into Egypt, but actually many more of them follow him voluntarily, which actually now builds the Jewish community in Alexandria up into, it becomes massively sizable. So it actually kind of becomes a Jewish city, and so the city is actually divided. It grows there, but actually what happens is there's a kind of a decision made to divide the city, and the reason for dividing the city is so that the Jewish quarter, which is kind of over half the city, is able to kind of maintain kind of kosher rules and laws, so that in that city they can be as kind of pure as it's possible to be in the Gentile world, if you think of it like that. And the community itself is far bigger than the one in Jerusalem at this stage. And it becomes, if you like, the seat of Jewish thinking and kind of culture. So which is why, as I say, that it becomes the centre of Hellenized Judaism. And it's in this kind of, as I say, so the Greek language, culture and philosophy start to Hellenize the Jews in all regions, particularly places like Alexandria. Jerusalem now is part of the Seleucid Empire. It's kind of gone back. Then it goes back to the Ptolemaic. It kind of gets traded or sometimes won in battle between the two. And it's during this period, around 250 AD, that the Bible gets translated into Greek in Alexandria with 70 elders. And you see that wonderful kind of imagery that comes right the way through. You get there in Exodus where there's 70 elders, and then the 70 elders in the book of Ezekiel who are sold out and aren't a corrupt eldership, which eventually becomes the Sanhedrin with its 71 plus some special people, because the number is never exact. It's kind of a symbolic 70, so it seems it's always 71, 72, 73, 74, but it's that kind of pragmatic around the 70 mark. And so they come together, and again that's really key for us, because it kind of helps again having I always remember as a young Christian, you hear people kind of say, oh, in the original Greek, in the original Hebrew, and it's really fantastic, the idea of there was an original thing. What we have is we actually have history that has given us a whole host of stuff that our English translations have to blend together, which doesn't mean that there wasn't something there, but actually the wisdom comes from multiple angles, if I can put it that way. And I quite like that now. I'm kind of at first I just think that seemed too messy, but actually it feels much more like the way the Lord does things now. That nature is messy but beautiful. I can put it that way. the kind of the fingerprints of God is that in human terms it looks too complex, but actually somehow it comes together with this kind of beautiful shape and structure to all the different threads to it. And so I don't see, just on a apologetic point of view, that we should be embarrassed by that, because obviously in Islam, the Quran comes down out of heaven, it's unchanged, it's eternally been what it is. In Mormonism, it's the eternal word has been gifted once to Joseph, to Joe Green. What's his name? Yeah. Joseph Smith, sorry, Green. Why is it Joe Green? That's Giuseppe Verdi, isn't it?
Yeah,
sorry, that was Joseph Smith, not Joseph Green. So, but so in one sense, that's if you like angelic wisdom, because those, they're angels that give those things. They come with one voice and one script, and it's there. Whereas this is the wonderful way in which kind of God is in everything and through everything, and all the bits are coming together. And actually, they give us a story which is remarkable in its in the way it suddenly appears, if I can put it that way, out of all of the flows and the kind of elements,
but it is so consistent.
But it's so consistent in the narrative it creates. That's the point. And that you can find something, an ancient source which gives you a slightly different view, and yet somehow it confirms exactly what you always thought about the text. So it's for me, it kind of becomes much more of the thrill of the discovery about these things. So as we move on from 250, Rome, of course, has been growing, and up in Europe, it defeats the Gauls and the Italian Celts, and Sicily becomes its first Mediterranean province. So Hannibal, who is part of the Ptolemaic Empire, which is kind of split out of Alexander's, then goes to war with Rome. The Seleucid Empire is now under a guy called Antiochus III, and it's growing. Hannibal commits suicide in 183 BC. 175, Antiochus IV Epiphanes becomes king of Syria and the Seleucid Empire. Now he's an important character, as we're going to see in a minute. In 169, he invades Egypt, but he has to withdraw. And in his kind of frustration on his way back with his army, he decides to go and capture Jerusalem instead. So it's kind of, failed to make it into Egypt. He's trying to make the most of Egypt's slightly weakened state after its battle with the Romans. So he captures Jerusalem. But actually, Rome prevents Antiochus actually capturing Alexandria, because they're now moving into Alexandria. So he desecrates the temple in Jerusalem, and he stops the sacrifices. And Antiochus is one of the wings and the heads of the leopard. If you remember, the leopard has its wings and its head, 4 sets. And there is an element, you see, in which he then becomes the type of the understanding of Daniel's prophecy, where it talks about the one who is to come, who becomes therefore a type of the Antichrist. And he kind of models that, and of course he is one of the wings, and it talks in Daniel about one coming with the wings of abomination, who puts an end to the sacrifices, and it becomes the abomination that makes desolate, and so on. And he dedicates the temple to Zeus, and so the abomination that makes desolate is pagan imagery, and wings coming into the temple, which happens again in 40 AD, when Caligula sets up his image in the temple. Although some historians think he failed, but we certainly know he was trying to, and it makes sense prophetically that he succeeded, but literally dies days later. So Caligula does the same.
Isn't Antiochus sacrifice a pig?
Oh yes, I think he definitely. And as I say, he becomes he defiles the thing deliberately. Yeah.
Sets up an idol.
And sets up the idol. Yeah. So 166, Judas Maccabeus and the Jews fight back. Of course, Maccabeus then becomes a very famous name within Judaism, and the Maccabeans and the Book of Maccabeus and so on in the Inter-Testamental period, because he becomes, if you like, a type of the Messiah in Jewish thinking. Because we've had, if you like, someone who looks, although the timings don't fit Daniel, but he looks like he fulfills the bit in Daniel of the abomination making desolate. And in theory, at that point, he's supposed to come after the Messiah, but at the very least, the idea that perhaps the Messiah is alive and this is all part of that period is probably likely to be part of the theological and commentariat's backdrop to what's going on at this period. And so under Judas Maccabeus, the temple gets restored and it gets cleansed, and Hanukkah is instigated to celebrate the event. So Judas Maccabeus now becomes a kind of a model for the Messiah, who is effectively forcibly ejecting the defiling presence of the invading armies. So that becomes kind of part of the typology that in popular thinking of how the Messiah should be. 164, Antiochus, he dies. The Maccabean rebellion continues. Judas Maccabeus is killed 4 years later, and his brother Jonathan takes over the leadership of the rebellion. But by 157, so you see how fortunes are turning around, Judea becomes semi-independent principality. And so in the ancient world with the various empires, you had places that they governed directly and places which they allowed, if you like, to maintain the level of cultural identity by giving them the ability to be sort of semi-independent. So it becomes a principality in our modern context. Of course, Wales was like that for a long, long time. It was kind of sort of had its own identity, but it wasn't independent enough to be a kingship. I'm just thinking, I'm probably going to run through all of my slides pretty soon, so we'll probably just do everything in one sitting. Is that okay tonight? We'll do it that way. Now, 141 BC, things are now under Simon Maccabees, and Jerusalem is fully liberated, and Judea becomes a semi-independent kingdom. So you can see how, if you like, this messianic movement under the Maccabeans is kind of being crescendoing and growing from its terrible low point of the temple being defiled. In 135 BC, John Hyrcanus is the latest kind of in this line of the family. He's Simon's son. He becomes the high priest, and the Hasmonean dynasty of priestly rulers comes into being. So they've been kind of military leaders up to this point. Simon now becomes a priest, and the Hasmonean dynasty is being born. If you remember, well, we'll mention it as we kind of go along. This is seen at the time as being a fulfillment of Ezekiel's prophecy about the crown and the turban being worn by one individual. And again, obviously, as we look at it, we understand Jesus as the real fulfillment of it. But you can understand within the history, there's kind of scriptures sort of being sealed up. We're in this process that we have some prophetic context for, and Ezekiel has looked and he has seen the turban and the crown being worn by one person, and so the Maccabean family are kind of fulfilling that. So it looks like we're in a period, if you're Jewish, of kind of a whole load of prophecy kind of being fulfilled. And at a certain level it is, if you can put it that way. It's just that, as I said, the word of God is living and active. It produces fruit one year with a couple of small apples on it, and next year it's got a whole harvest of apples. It's the thing kind of grows. So it's around 130 BC. I'll just say around because all of these groups kind of are lost a little bit in the midst of time. But the Pharisees start to emerge as a sect, and they represent the kind of growing ritual devotion that's centered at the temple. So right the way through the old Persian and then the Greek empires, the Jews have been spread around. They have a lot more freedom now. They have culturally, as I say, some are becoming very kind of Greek. But within the various synagogues, the Pharisees start to emerge as a kind of as a holiness type of movement. And it's around devotion around the temple. So we've been in synagogues all over the place, and we've learnt our ways of being Jews in a practical, pragmatic way. But we've got the temple, and it's there and we've got some autonomy now. We've got a little bit more freedom. We should honour our temple and so on. And so that's the kind of the agenda that really seems to start to grow them. And they're also reacting to the Hellenists, who kind of take a more philosophical approach to their faith. So they're less devoted to the rituals and so on, but much more into the high thinking and so on. So the Pharisees kind of become a power base within the people. That statement is not an individual event; it's kind of a summary event, but it's around 130. It's the kind of the movement that we then understand as becoming the Pharisees.
What does the word Pharisee mean? That's
a really good question, Andrew. I will know next time. As soon as you asked it, I thought, I can't believe I've never looked that up to find out what it means. It may well be after a person. You never know. It's often the way these things go. John Hyrcanus, though, at 120, he feels insulted by the leaders of this new movement, and so he repudiates them and calls himself a Sadducee. So you see these movements being born, which are going to dominate the scene in Jesus' day, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So like the Pharisees, they have ritual devotion, but they see the temple as a kind of political power base. And very significantly, because they are also priestly, remember, the Maccabean family, they actually control the temple. So the Pharisees are now stuck in a bit of a position, because because they fall out. The story, which I've said before, but is just unfortunately, it's kind of amusingly, is that apparently it's one of the Pharisees that actually kind of queries whether he's really Jewish because his mother was slept around a bit, and so he's insulted by that, as he would be. You insult my mother, so I'm going to repudiate the Pharisees. And so this movement that we find Jesus with one on either side, kind of trying to crush in on him, so he's caught between the two of them. It all kind of comes down to an insult about somebody's mother. Again, I'm putting the around these times because we cannot trace them right the way back. And we first know about the Essenes in Josephus, and they seem to emerge at this point as a kind of reaction to the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And so they are very deliberately have a spirituality that doesn't require the temple. And it seems that they became quite popular with the priests, but as the priests were growing, there were an awful lot of priests who didn't have a huge amount to do. And so you can see the attraction of a movement that still kind of honours the idea of priesthood, Levitehood and so on, but doesn't actually require the administrations of the temple to be able to do what they do. So John the Baptist, who of course was born into a serious Jewish family, a serious priestly family, his father is a descendant of Aaron, and so is his mother. So both of them are, and John is born in that context, and he does become an Essene in the way he kind of dresses. We can't be 100% sure. And I think when we have done some of the bits walking through Jesus' life, we highlight that there's there's references sometimes in the Old Testament. I think the phrase is to certain righteous men, which seems to be a euphemism for people from the Essene sect, referred to as certain righteous people. So they're kind of characters, again, that kind of work their way in, although they're not called Essenes. But that perhaps isn't a big surprise, because the name doesn't seem to be as strongly attached. Which is why even today there are people who question whether they existed. The consensus is still they definitely did exist, because the Essene, the term, actually comes from Josephus. But what you see these other kind of references to a similar group. And so it's kind of, they were perhaps less of a group that wore their badge with pride, but they were very definite kind of movement.
When you Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yeah, so they're normally understood as being an Essene community. But the reason why there's some ambiguity is just to do with the naming. But the funny thing is that issue of how solidly the group is named probably allows us to identify, as I say, certain righteous people or whatever that may well be references to this group. 116 BC, the Seleucid Empire kind of collapses, and as it does so, there's a fully independent Jewish state now led by its priest, emerges and extends their territory, captures Edom, which again is something that was prophesied, and this is where I ran out of time to kind of put all of the background and prophecy, but the absorbing of Edom into Judea. So the Edomites become proselyte Jews. Herod's family, his parents, Herod's not been born yet, are part of these. And they properly convert, to Judaism. I put here the scepter is very clearly within Judah at this point, so reference to Genesis 49. So it feels like there's no, well, it says that the scepter won't depart till the Messiah comes, but the scepter, they clearly have the scepter, i.e. they have self-autonomy, they have the ability to rule themselves. The 73 BC, Herod is born. So ethnically he's an Edomite, but religiously he is fully Jewish. In 67 BC, there's a little bit of internecine fighting that breaks out in the Hasmonean family. And Pompey captures Jerusalem and annexes Judea and Syria for Rome. So suddenly now Judea, because they've been kind of autonomous for this while, as the Seleucid part of the Greek Empire has been kind of going downhill. And now Rome is kind of is emerging. It's already kind of moving into Africa. It's taken over the Ptolemaic area. Now the Seleucid Empire is collapsing. It's now moving out across into Syria and so on. So the Hasmoneans, though, are still important. Things aren't going as well. So the Romans are very good at kind of recognizing who you keep in power politically, and recognise within them they had the ability to control things. 61 BC, Julius Caesar wins his first victories. In 54, a guy called Marcus Crassus loots and ruins the temple. So we kind of seem to be repeating history. It was looted before by Antiochus. And of course, will no doubt have fermented a whole way of thinking about we need to find another Judas Maccabeus, you see, at this kind of period. And just interestingly here, if we take Cyrus's decree as the beginning of Daniel's 70 weeks, this will be the period. So you can just think how these things would kind of match together. The temple has been rebuilt at this point, but it is a time of trouble, and it's about the right period of time. If you're looking at, in those kind of rough kind of things, if you add 483 years to Cyrus's decree, I think it is. I think that's how it comes out. It's about this period. Can't remember how accurate it is, but it's hitting around here. So you can understand why, again, there's a kind of waves of messianic expectation. We've had recent history. We've seen some things going. Now suddenly we're in a period which it could be, of course we see it. Cyrus's decree is not the one, because it was a much more generic one, and we actually have the copy of it than is specified in Daniel's prophecy. But you can understand how it could all come together. In 49 BC, Caesar famously crosses the Rubicon. Rome goes into civil war with Pompey and the Senate. But in 48 BC, Herod is made governor of Galilee, and his brother Faisal is the governor of Jerusalem. But they're totally ruthless, and they're hated by the Pharisees, who don't see them as being proper Jews. So it's a kind of classic case of because your parents weren't, even though he was born circumcised on the 8th day and so on. In 47, Pompey is assassinated, but his son Sextus continues his battle with Caesar. The Roman civil war causes a proxy war between various factions of the Hasmonean family in Jerusalem, that dynasty, and a coup leaves Herod as an enemy of Antigonus, who's now become the new head of the Hasmonean leadership. So he has to flee Jerusalem. And he flees, actually not Jerusalem, he's governor of Galilee. He flees Galilee and heads up to Rome. 46 BC, a guy called Theudas looks to take on the messianic mantle around this period, as I said, and he leads 400 men in revolt against Rome. He's actually captured. The story, which again we hear in Josephus, but I mention him here because he's mentioned in the New Testament, if you remember. He's cited by Gamaliel as when he's saying, we all remember that people went out with Theudas. So he's right at this kind of period, which is in this kind of beginning of this messianic kind of thinking period. He basically tells people it's a bit like a kind of David Koresh sort of messianic movement. He basically tells everybody he is a prophet like Moses. And 400 people follow him out from Jerusalem because he's going to part the seas of the Jordan, part the waters of the Jordan to prove it all. But he gets attacked by the Romans on the way, and he gets captured, taken alive. But he has his head cut off and taken to Jerusalem. But he kind of represents that kind of, I suppose, he's a good example of the messianic kind of ferment that's taking off. 45 BC, Caesar defeats Sextus in Africa, and now he's got total control of Rome. So he brings in the Julian calendar, and Octavian is adopted as his heir. 44 BC, of course, Julius Caesar is assassinated, and the triumvirate of Octavian, Mark Antony, and Marcus Lepidus is formed and takes over the Roman Empire. And then the 1st of January 42 BC, Caesar is posthumously recognised as being a god. In the same year, it's a couple of years later, isn't it? 40 to 39 BC. Herod now gets elected by the Roman Senate as being king of the Jews. So now that the Senate has settled down, they can resolve this issue. So remember, he's had to flee from Galilee because the resurgence of the Hasmonean dynasty. And so in 37, he returns to Judea with a Roman army and attacks his own people to make himself really, really popular. And he gains the throne. So the Pharisees are now totally sure. It looks like the scepter has departed from Judah, so they're looking for a Messiah. Because a Messiah is definitely needed. They don't have control anymore. and the Messiah was supposed to have at least been born by the time things are kind of going wrong like this. 36 BC, Octavian defeats Sextus. He has developing tensions with Mark Antony. 32 AD BC, Mark Antony, who's moved down to Egypt, and of course is now living with Cleopatra. They commit suicide together. And Octavian, by this time, is now using the title Divophilius, son of God, or son of a god. And so he's followed Alexander's model. And so 27 BC, the Senate then gives supreme power to Octavius. So he takes the name Augustus and becomes the first Roman Empire. He develops an obsession with censuses and counting allegiances. But the thing that I always think is just interesting to note at this point is that at the point that he comes to the throne, he is calling himself the Son of God. So the Son of God is now ruling over the kind of entire known world, kind of, or it's the way it kind of works. Meanwhile, to bolster his claim to Jewishness, Herod starts rebuilding work on the inner sanctuary of the temple. It's 19 or 18 BC. It's the 18th year of his rule, according to Josephus. And on completion, about 18 months later, he starts work on the bustling outer courts. And it's now this point, after 18 months, on 19 to 18, it's going to be 46 years before Jesus cleanses the temple in 29 AD, which we read about in John 2, where they say to him, this temple has been being built for 46 years, if you remember. So you see the timings beginning to come together on these things. So we get our first kind of anchor point for dating Jesus' ministry. Augustus was ruled as emperor until AD 15, so it's during the rule of Augustus. Herod the Great reigns as king of Judea until 4 BC, so we know Jesus is born before Herod dies in 4 BC. So, and interestingly, I want to note here, 65 BC, 6,000 Pharisees died for rejecting a registration that required them to pledge allegiance to Augustus and Herod, which we're going to see next week and the weeks to come, is really key to the timing of Jesus' birth. And despite the oft-made claim that there's no evidence of a census, there is a huge amount of evidence of the census. We have great long tracts about it. It's just it wasn't for taxation, which is why people missed it. It was for allegiance. It was to sign allegiance to Caesar, not for tax. And that's why they were looking for tax receipts and so on, and they're not there. But he never says that in Luke, so he never says it. So in this context, we've got political governance, spiritual control, and populist power in a complicated standoff. Jewish nation has more than 24 sects and 4 major divisions. The Hellenistic scenes, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, although Josephus ignores, which one does he ignore? I can't remember. He ignores one of them, and he also lists the Zealots. But the Zealots actually only come into existence in 4 BC, and we haven't quite got to 4 BC yet. But it's Judas the Galilean who becomes the kind of the founder of the Zealots movement, which probably is around. Well, Jesus is probably living in Egypt now as a young boy, well, as a baby boy. But so Luke's Gospel starts with a priest serving in a sanctuary that's been restored by an Edomite king. He's supported by a power that's trashed the temple in previous under Marcus Crassus. That's the Edomite king who is supported by a power that's trashed the temple. He's got a son who's going to reject the temple. So, because obviously the priest here is Zechariah. His son John is going to reject the temple, probably become an Essene. So Judea is a very confused and complex place. Messiah is definitely wanted, needed, but no one can agree what they should be like. And that was my final slide. So there we go. Put it all in one run. There's the one that there are some bits towards the end of that, like with the coming in of Edom. That if we, at some point I want to add in some slides about some of the prophecies about Edom, because you can find those bits there. But that's kind of you see the kind of the rolling out and the telling of the story. Hopefully, does anyone want to ask any questions?
Going back to the kings of the north and the king of the south.
Yeah.
Some see that as also a prophetic power.
They do, yeah.
Within Islam.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Because Turkey could be the king of the north.
Yeah.
Because there's the struggle in Islam between 2 power blocks. It's not Saudi Arabia, obviously, and what have you.
Yeah.
It's Egypt in Turkey.
Right.
And so I've heard it postulated that the king of the north reckon also looked prophetically at this.
Yeah. Well,
they feature in this,
Yeah.
and it's still ongoing now because Erdogan now obviously wants to make himself caliph, presumably.
Caliphates, yeah. I mean, these are the bits where I said tonight we try and do the vanilla, because there's a lot where, because in vanilla terms, I've seen also the north and south as being Seleucid and Ptolemaic, because they're the major division of Greece, but equally I've seen it being contrasted between Rome and Hannibal and the Egyptians and so on. So this is where it's not that any of them necessarily are wrong, but they're where I've stuck on the bits that I think are consensus. Then there are, and people make good cases for it. They'll say, like for instance, just to kind of, as we're recording, get into trouble, but there's a strong kind of Protestant tradition that the horn that uproots the three horns was the Holy Roman Empire kind of succeeding from that's the mix of clay and iron and so on. And you can weigh up arguments, and you kind of and pray it through and think, I can see some of that, and maybe not that, and so on. But yeah, so sorry, I'm not trying to dismiss that at all, Howard. I'm just saying I wanted to kind of just stay with the simple. This is where we all kind of pretty much agreed.
It's just that I don't know what the dominant view on the kings of north and south are.
Yeah.
As I mentioned it.
No,
so
that's right.
Interesting because you have these two
power bases, yeah.
And they're mentioned as part of a puzzle.
Yeah.
Whereas Seleucus, what have you, was actually east. So
goes, yeah.
The kingdom in east rather than the.
Yeah, no, I think.
So geographically, I'm just trying to sort of get a view of it.
Get a view of it. No.
I would love to see you tonight. Just run us through Revelation.
I would panic at that one.
It's interesting.
There's a challenge.
Nebuchadnezzar is not really satisfied with just being the head of gold.
Yeah.
So in chapter 3 he has the whole image of gold.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's
and then chapter 4 he's gone mad.
Yeah, he tries to take it all on, doesn't he? Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah. No, and I think this is the thing that's so fantastic. When you look at the endurance of Christianity as a faith, or the Judeo-Christian revelation, if you put it that kind of way, there's so many layers to it, and one of which is the richness of Scripture and the way in which the Holy Spirit opens things up. And in different periods and times, you can have people who have come across, and for their time, it's like the Holy Spirit draws something out that makes total sense of their day, if you like. But then 100 years later, someone's seeing something totally different. You think, well, they can't both be right, but actually perhaps they can, in the sense of the way in which the Lord has given this dynamic, multifaceted view that somehow, as you bring it into the real context, he's able to draw out, and you suddenly interpret in certain ways. And so what I do know is that I say I don't want to do. My dad's done huge amounts on Revelation over the years, and I always grew up making this point that actually you can find really good arguments in almost every century for fulfillment things of different bits of Revelation. Yeah. So now what that left me with was the idea that the only thing that seemed foolish was to say all of it is all fulfilled only in 7 years at the end, if that makes sense. What it really means is even if you've got 7 years at the end, the point is it's been relevant for all of history. So if you kind of reduce it to it's just wait, unless you live through that 7 years, it hasn't got much to say to you. But actually the beginning of the book, so where he always used to put it to us, is it declares itself as the revelation of Jesus reigning in his ascension. So in that sense it does cover whatever period you're born into now, even if there is a future moment you're looking at. So therefore, as you pray it through, and I think that's generally true. So I know what's saying that is that I think if you look at the kind of the battle that you have right the way through history, you have, like, if you think about what typifies the beast, well, the beast has a prophet, and it seems to be of oppressed people. It's made up of oppressed people with a prophet. And whether that's kind of communism, which has its prophets in people like Marx or whatever, or whether it's in Islam, which has Muhammad as its prophet, you see the battle between that and the harlot who rides on the beast. So they have a sort of symbiotic relationship. They're at war with each other, but they're both warring the church, which is all about trade and commerce and sensuality and me-centered and so on. And actually, you look at most of history, you can fit into that paradigm. Exactly which one looks like which. What human institutions look like they represent more and more than the other. It can vary with time, but somehow the spiritual forces keep on rolling right the way through.
And I think what's so amazing is you look at the prophecies unravelled.
Yeah.
And what amazing foresight given by God to these men. And it makes you think, people who call themselves prophets today, I almost think, well, prophecy ended when Jesus was born.
Mm-hmm.
True prophecy.
Well, I think, so New Testament prophecy has a slightly different role, partly by context. That partly, we use the same word for what was effectively a civic position, being a prophet in the Old Testament time. So, in other words, there were prophets speaking into every potentate and ruler, but not all of them were prophets of Yahweh. And we get that, of course, story comes out through that there are prophets standing around some of the Jewish kings who aren't prophets of Yahweh. They're effectively what we might think of now as kind of being various kind of types of occultist or the false prophets. They're looking for spiritual guidance, but not to Yahweh. So in that sense, what these were people who are stepping into that role, who had a requirement, therefore, to deliver something of supernatural insight and wisdom that the Lord has put his hand of protection over, and they speak with his voice. And so as we come to the New Testament now, prophecy is about building up and encouragement of people, as Paul puts it. So it's become much more of a dynamic process for the low caste rather than the high caste leadership of the world, if you know what I mean. So it's but it is, you're absolutely right though, John, isn't it? It's remarkable when you get like a little throwaway phrase like I like the ones in Zechariah because they're not so well known. With the whatchamacallits who are going to be like will be like the Jebusites. Well, that's such a brilliant description of actually what happens to them, which is they don't intermarry, but they are now absorbed into Judea, which is exactly what happens to the Jebusites. So they really redo something that, and he names the town, says this is where it's going to happen. Good. Right, well, I will stop recording and hopefully this one will come out. I've got a few to now